Any
questions, anyone?
Esos 9 billones de dólares que entran en Cuba, ¿en qué se invierte? ¿Cómo
Bueno,
va a parar esos 9 billones de dólares?
la mayoría de ese dinero va a parar a las manos del gobierno porque hay en Cuba there are two exchange rates in Cuba between the peso and the dollar, right? One, the convertible peso, the relationship is 1-to-1, but the non-convertible peso is 25-to-1, I think, right? So you send a relative $1,000, supposedly they should be paid, if they were able to sell those dollars in the black market, they would get 25,000 pesos, but they only get 1,000, right? Because the government will exchange at the official exchange rate. So essentially, the government is keeping most of the money that comes from abroad for themselves. Yeah, and another thing is wages in certain sectors like tourism, for example. First of all, not everybody can work in tourism in Cuba, right? You have to be selected by you have to be a member of the Communist Party, and you have to be selected by a specific organization in Cuba. And then workers actually are paid also in convertible pesos, not in unconvertible pesos. As a result, the real income that they receive is only a fraction of what they should receive, which is, by the way, something condemned by the International Workers' Organization, but Cuba doesn't respond to this kind of pressures.
Yeah, my estimates at this moment is that about $7.3 billion a year are sent from abroad to help the Cubans. Again, as Dr. Mugo has said, a lot of it somehow ends in the hands of the only practical economic activity that exists in Cuba, which is the government, which is, by the way, completely controlled by the Castro family. Not only now Raúl, but their descendants are in charge, or their relatives are in charge of all of the government activities. The possibility of really having an economic activity that would be beneficial to the population at large is practically non-existent unless you do it on the black market. That's the only possibility that exists. And a very salient fact that really surprised me is that all of those remittances became very important during the last 8 years. When President George W. Bush was in power, he only allowed $400 every quarter to be sent to Cuba. That was completely abolished by the Obama administration, and therefore the amount of remittances grew enormously, multiplied enormously over time. One of the interesting facts that is really incredible to imagine is that particular situation that Daniel Murgo has just referred to, which is condemned by the International Labor Organization for the last 30 years, which is that the Cubans actually received only about 6% of their salaries, because when all of the hotels, the businesses, Cuba is really in the hands of, as one point Daniel Murgo was saying, all that debt which was about $8 billion in the late 1980s, became worthless. But it was bought by Pernod Ricard, controls Rome. It was bought by Cherry Corporation, controls nickel and cobalt. It was bought by eventually Imperial Tobacco. Beginning was Tabacalera. Whatever. Cuba, incredible as it might seem, is in the hands of foreigners, only 49%. But all of the most important productions are basically done by foreigners, including the hotels, of course. This is how it started. But they pay the workers only what the government wants. And the government has a group called ACOREC, which goes from the Communist Party, select the people that work, let's put the hotels, that's the most known example. They go to the hotels. Now, they work there. They get $400, let's say, typical $400 a month to work in a hotel. They work for Meliá or Barceló, whatever they are, the different ones. Now, the foreign investor has to give ACOREC all that money in dollars or hard currency, euros, whatever. Then the ACOREC turns around and gives it to the Cuban workers in pesos, which are 25 to 1, which means that basically, and this has been condemned by the International Labor Organization, part of the United Nations system, for years, and they don't care. They do this, and people are just going through the motions as if Cuba was a normal government, a normal country. It's really completely abnormal. Look at the amount of people, look at the amount of blacks that you see. Now you see a little bit more, but for years there was no black or mulatto or anything among the directors, the political leaders, the Politburo, the Communist Party. It's really the most abject discrimination that exists in Cuba is by the Castro brothers against the majority of the Cuban population, and nobody even talks about that. That is, even you don't see it in any place. That's what Cuba is all about right now. Any comment or question? Yes.
Yes. Was the imposition of the political embargo the reason for the destruction of the sugar industry in Cuba and the transfer to the subsidized industry in Florida?
Well, I don't think so. I'll tell you why. Because, and it's in the first book, after something which is very close to some of us. I don't know if Jorge Sotolongo is still here. Oh my God, no, I think it's mine. I forgot to, I'm sorry. No, it's mine. It's a big mistake. And that is my son Manning, who knew I was doing this. You know, I'm going to pull his ears after this. And I've lost the train of thought. What was the question again?
Was the American embargo the reason for the destruction of the sugar industry in Cuba and the transfer to the subsidized?
Okay, and now I get it. Get it back. Well, you have heard about a group called the Van Van, famous orchestra. You know where the Van Van comes from? From Fidel Castro saying, las 10 millones de toneladas van, pero que van. That's where it came from. And it was supposed to do the largest harvest in the history of Cuba. It only came up with something very similar to what was produced in 1953, 8.2 million tons. Well, the Cubans then turned around. It was completely, some of the things that happened, difficult even to fathom. For example, Cuba abolished accounting. No accounting. No accounting in the finance ministry. No accounting in the central bank. No accounting in any business. I know a lot of people from the Soviet bloc. I mean, I worked with them in the purchasing power parties that I was doing with the Wharton group and the United Nations and the World Bank. We were doing these purchasing power parties that everybody uses now. Well, so I met a lot of Czechoslovakian and Hungarian. I said, what you see in Cuba is not socialism. This is not socialism. We used to call it, remember, socialismo con pachanga. Okay, socialismo con pachanga. The Soviet Union told, oh look, we're giving you at today's prices, what the Soviet Union was giving at the peak, as I already told you, was $20 billion a year. $20 billion a year, the equivalent. So they said, all right, look, forget about whatever little industry remains, very little practically, or the commercial activities. Just produce sugar. That's all we need. Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union, whatever. Now, we expect you to produce 14 or 15 million tons of sugar a year. That was the objective. It's in the plan. So they actually built 7 sugar mills. Cuba had 161 sugar mills. In 1992, when the Soviet Union said, no más, it had all those sugar mills. Then, of course, they began to cannibalize the sugar mills and sending it to the Dominican Republic or to Haiti or to other places. It was the Cubans that destroyed the sugar industry. It was the Cubans. Cuba produced 7.2 million tons of sugar in 1992, 8.1 million tons of sugar in 1989. And because of their art, because as Professor Alves said, the cost of arrogance, they began to cannibalize sort of those sugar mills at the low point, which was in the early 2000s, more or less. There were only 26 sugar mills producing in Cuba. 26 sugar mills only producing, and they had taken 100,000 caballerías out of sugar production. It was self-inflicted harm that they did to the Cuban. Let me tell you that I met in Cuba, where I was part of the revolutionary government at the beginning. I met in Cuba Jack Chonchol, agricultural economist, who later became the agricultural minister of Salvador Allende in Chile, communists in Chile, whatever. He wrote articles all over the place. And René Dumont, a famous agricultural economist from France, said, you are making a big mistake. They concentrated all of the land in the hands of the government. They did the same that the Soviet Union did to the Ukrainians, which is now moving. They starved the Ukrainians completely. They killed the Ukrainians. They didn't allow the Ukrainians to have their own agriculture, which they had. Well, that's what Fidel Castro did to Cuba. That's what Fidel Castro and their group did to Cuba.
Regarding the embargo, I would like to add one thing that Jorge mentioned in his presentation, is that, first of all, the embargo was imposed by the United States, but not by other countries of the world. So Cuba was always free to trade with European countries. And even though this was a nominal embargo, so that American companies or even American companies in other countries were not supposed to trade with Cuba, I have lived the experience, right, of how in the early 70s, for example, when Argentina went back to democracy and Perón went back to Argentina, the government at the time that was very sympathetic to Cuba, they foster export from American companies. Ford, for example, exported cars and pickup trucks to Cuba. Of course, they got paid, and the Argentinian government got stuck with the bill. And again, in 1983, when after another period of military regime, Argentina regained democracy. Again, the new government was also sympathetic to Cuba and also lend them money again. And this is the source of the $11 billion that Cubans owe to Argentina, and they basically owe to everybody because every single dollar they have received as a loan, they have never repaid. So, and everything has been squandered because they changed the systems of incentives and created a system in which complying with the rule of the party and, as Jorge said, stealing was the new way of life, right? And this is nothing new because this system in which you pretend that you work and the government pretends that they pay you, and in the meantime you steal as much as you can, was basically the way in which the Soviet Union functioned, right? It even has a name. It's called kleptocracy, meaning the government of the thieves, right? So this is basically the result of removing good incentives for people to do things, to produce things, and putting in place incentives that lead to the destruction or the eventual destruction of different economic activities.
I think we should end with some word that from Lilian Castañeda. We bored you enough so, about the Lilian Castañeda Foundation, the Carlos Castañeda Foundation.
No, sencillamente quiero darle las gracias por haber venido y decirle que Luis va a recoger los papeles que ustedes quieran entregar, la encuesta, el sobre, lo que ustedes deseen entregar, él lo va a recoger. Haga su trabajo. Bueno, pues muchas gracias y creo que todavía queda vino y algo allá atrás si quieren antes de irse. Bueno.
Thank you.